Peppa Pig, the new neighbor. It all began early one morning. The sky was gray and the wind was driving dry leaves down the street. Peppa walked to the window and suddenly stopped. Out on the empty lot behind their house stood a house. Old, gray, with a sagging roof, but that lot had always been empty. Peppa was sure of it. "Mummy, Daddy!" she called. "Where did that house come from?" Mummy poured tea and Daddy flipped through his newspaper. "It's always been there, Peppa," said Daddy, too quickly, too calmly. Peppa frowned but said nothing. That day, Peppa and George were playing in the garden, and that's when they saw him for the first time. Standing behind the fence was a wolf, but not an ordinary one. His fur was snow white, almost glowing against the gray sky. His eyes, black, without any shine, and his smile, too straight, too empty of any real feeling. He simply stood there, silently staring at them. George huddled behind her. "Hello," the wolf finally said. His voice was strange, dry, like crunching snow. The next day, the white wolf stood by their gate. Daddy went out and shook his paw. Mummy invited him into the house. Peppa stayed back, feeling her hooves tense. "Who is that?" she asked. "Our old friend," Mummy said, smiling a little too widely. "You know him." But Peppa didn't know him. She was certain she didn't. On the third day, the white wolf sat with them at breakfast. He ate his porridge slowly. He didn't blink. His movements were too precise, like a wind-up toy. Whenever he looked at Peppa, she felt a cold chill run down her back. His paws were thin, too long for a normal wolf, and when he set down his spoon, the table creaked under his touch. On the fourth day, Peppa woke to the creaking of the floorboards. She opened her eyes. The white wolf stood in the doorway. His white fur glowed softly in the dim light of the room. He simply stood and stared. His shadow stretched in a long line across the floor to her bed. Peppa squeezed her eyes shut. When she opened them again, he was gone. But the door remained wide open. On the fifth day, strange changes began around the house. In the family photographs, someone new had appeared. A tall, blurred figure with a white patch where the face should be. His paw rested on Peppa's and George's shoulders. Their smiles in the pictures were too wide, drawn on almost. When Peppa finally gathered her courage and asked, "Why is he living with us?" Daddy calmly replied, "Peppa, he's always been part of our family." And Daddy said it as if he barely believed it himself. On the sixth night, Peppa and George decided to run away. They crept down the stairs, quietly opened the front door, but outside, there was no street, no garden, only thick white fog stretching endlessly into the distance, and in that fog shadows moved, tall, twisted. When they turned around, the white wolf was already behind them. He was closer than ever before. He slowly tilted his head to the side and whispered, "Home is where you are always expected." His voice was a whisper, scratching at the air. Peppa and George clung tightly to each other. The next morning, the pig family's house looked normal. Mummy set the table, Daddy read his newspaper, but in every family photograph now there were 5 figures, and in every window, if you looked closely, you could see a tall white figure standing just behind, and dark eyes staring straight at you, never blinking. Peppa Pig The Attic. It all started on a gloomy morning. Rain tapped quietly against the windows, and the air felt heavy. Peppa was walking down the hallway when she suddenly looked up. In the middle of the ceiling there was a wooden hatch. Dusty, handleless. It definitely hadn't been there before. Peppa froze. "Daddy, Mummy, what's that?" Daddy was the first to come over. He stared up for a long time. "Maybe it's always been there," he said, but his voice wavered. Mummy simply nodded and walked into the kitchen. The next day, Peppa dragged out a stepladder. George held it steady at the bottom, clutching his dinosaur toy. Peppa carefully climbed up and pulled the ring. The hatch opened with a creak. A cold, musty, dusty smell wafted out. "Let's go and see," said Peppa. George hesitated but followed her. They climbed up inside. Above them was the attic, dark, wide, windowless. All around lay old things, torn toys, crooked cupboards, cracked mirrors. Dust floated thickly in the air like fog. The floor creaked under their feet. When Peppa called out, "Mummy? Daddy?" there was no answer, not a sound. only the heavy, muffled silence. They decided to go back. Peppa looked around. Where the hatch to the hallway floor should have been, where they had just climbed up, there was now only a solid, dusty board. No hole, no hatch, as if it had never existed. Peppa screamed, "Mommy! Daddy! Help!" No answer, only the cold of the attic and endless emptiness stretching around them. They walked forward, holding hands tightly. Sometimes, among the junk in the darkness, strange objects appeared. Broken strollers, mirrors without reflections, dolls without faces. At one point they spotted a box. Written on it in chalk were the words, "Do not open." They carefully walked around it, but Peppa felt something watching them from inside the box. In the distance they heard voices. Mummy's voice. "Peppa, breakfast is ready." Daddy's voice. "Where are our little ones?" Peppa gripped George's hoof tighter. "Mummy, Daddy, we're here." But the voices sounded hollow, like an old broken recording. No real answer. They kept walking, and time lost all meaning. Sometimes at the edges of their vision, shapes flickered, tall, thin, but when they looked directly, nothing was there. On the fourth day, they found a mirror. Peppa approached it. Their reflections moved with a slight delay. Their faces were slightly distorted, and behind them, in the mirror, stood a shadow. Sometimes they heard footsteps behind them, software almost silent, but when they turned around, no one was there. On the seventh day, they saw a staircase, lit by a faint, pale light. They ran toward it, climbed up, and found themselves back in the same attic, darker, colder, even emptier, and next to them stood a box. On it was written, "For the new ones." From the depths of the attic came a rustling sound. Slow, approaching. Peppa and George huddled close together, and in the silence, a whisper came. "Now you are part of the house." Downstairs in the kitchen, Mummy set 2 cups on the table. "Children, breakfast," she called. Daddy glanced at the clock and shrugged. "They must be playing outside," he said. And no one ever mentioned the strange hatch in the ceiling again, or the stepladder, or the voices. And at night, if you listened very carefully, you could hear the soft tapping of little hooves and the creaking of an old board somewhere high, high above the ceiling. Peppa Pig, soft Daddy. The morning began as usual. Rain tapped on the roof and the windows were gray with mist. The kitchen smelled like toast. Daddy Pig entered the room, moving a little slower than normal, rubbing his neck. He sat down at the table, not just heavily but softly, as if his body gave way, like dough. Peppa looked at him more closely. When he smiled, his cheek didn't return to its normal shape. It stayed slightly pressed down, as if it had stuck to his chin. Mummy poured tea. George played with his toy dinosaur. No one said anything, but Peppa noticed. When Daddy picked up his cup, his hoof bent slightly unnaturally. It trembled like jelly. All day Daddy moved slowly. He barely spoke, and in the evening he sat in the armchair, staring at the wall, unblinking. When Mummy called him for dinner, he didn't answer right away. Then he stood up. But what rose from the chair wasn't quite him. It was something like him. His body peeled away from the backrest with a wet sound. On the fabric remained a mark, like a plasticine print. He walked to the table, stopped, then turned and silently went upstairs. The next morning, Daddy didn't come down. Peppa and George sat at the table. Mummy went to check. The bedroom was dark, even though the window was open. Daddy Pig sat on the edge of the bed, gently rocking back and forth. He no longer looked like Daddy. His shape was almost the same, but too round. His face, slightly crooked, like someone had tried to copy it from memory. Eyes, cloudy, glassy. Lips, trembling, though he said nothing. Mummy called his name gently. He turned his head slowly in jerks and stood up. When he stepped forward, one foot sank into the floor and stayed there until it peeled free with a wet stretch. He didn't attack. He just walked, quietly, without a sound, straight toward her. Mummy stepped back, closed the door. Later the house grew colder. The smell, sweet, like melted wax. On the hallway floor appeared smeared footprints. George found Daddy's glasses in the corner. They were soft, almost warm. Daddy Pig never opened the door again, but he was still in the house. Sometimes there were soft, wet footsteps, a heavy creaking, long, deep breaths. And then he came out. Not from the room, from the wall. A curve of pink mass slowly slid across the floor, echoing his shape. No legs, no hooves, no neck, just mass. Pink, warm, breathing. Peppa and George ran to Mummy. They slammed the living room door and braced it with a chair. But something sticky was already oozing through the gap beneath the door. They ran upstairs, but the house grew quieter. Too quiet. Daddy was spreading. He didn't want to talk anymore. He wanted to be together, in one body, no forms, no names. The next day, the house was calm, everything looked normal, clean, silent, only the floor glistened, the walls slightly damp. On the kitchen table stood 2 teacups and 1 ribbon. On the floor, a smooth, even stain. In the very center, a pair of glasses. No one entered that house again, but if you stand by the door and listen, you might hear a breath, slow, deep, as if something is waiting.
Peppa Pig, The Forest, with no way out. It was a quiet, cloudy day, light but without sun. A thin, almost invisible mist hovered above the ground. The pig family decided to have a picnic near the forest. Daddy Pig found a large clearing among sparse trees. The grass was soft and dry. Everything felt peaceful. On the blanket were sandwiches, fruit, and a thermos of tea. Peppa was blowing soap bubbles. George played with his toy dinosaur. Time moved slowly and comfortably. A white butterfly fluttered by. It circled above the clearing and vanished into the trees. George ran after it. Peppa followed. They took only a few steps. The ground was dry, leaves rustled under their feet. They stopped near a bush and turned around. The clearing was gone. No sign of their parents. Only forest behind them. The trees stood closer together now. The branches wove into each other overhead, shutting out the sky. The sound faded. Even their footsteps were quiet, as if the ground itself was muffling them. Peppa and George turned back, but every step brought them to the same places, the same stump, the same stone, the same tree with a scratch mark. Time passed. The light dimmed. The forest seemed aware of them. The branches pressed closer. The air turned cold. They found a stream, narrow like a thread. Its water flowed in both directions at once. Peppa bent down to drink, but saw her reflection. It didn't move. It just stared. They ran, stumbled. George cried without sound. The forest swallowed even their emotions. Suddenly it was night. No sunset, no warning. Just darkness, thick and heavy. Small lights flickered between the trees, soft, yellow. Peppa led George toward them. Another clearing, a picnic blanket, a basket, just like before. But the grass was burned, the tree limbs overhead charred. The thermos held water. George's toy cracked as if someone had stepped on it. They stepped closer. The blanket was wet. The basket empty. Their footprints lay in the dirt, scattered, leading in all directions, as if they had already been here many times. A rustle, a figure among the trees, a shape like Mummy Pig. It didn't move, just stood. Peppa stepped forward. The figure vanished into the woods. They followed. Branches scraped their skin. The darkness thickened. The figure was gone again. The forest, unchanged, everything repeating. Days may have passed, or hours. Peppa no longer ran, George no longer played. They simply walked. Nowhere, no exit. They sat by a large stone. The stone was warm, as if someone had just left it. Carved into it, a circle and 2 dots. A face, smiling. No sun, no moon. Just gray light. Peppa closed her eyes. George stared ahead at the path. The white butterfly returned, but now it was black. Peppa Pig, lost episode, silence. It started with a rasp. In the morning, Peppa tried to call George, but her voice came out weak, as if she had a cold. Mummy Pig gave her some warm tea. Everyone thought it would pass. But by evening, Peppa's voice had almost vanished. She tried to speak, but her words barely came out, like something was pressing on her throat from the inside. Sometimes her mouth moved, but no sound followed. She tried to laugh, but it was just an open mouth and silence. The next day, Peppa could no longer speak at all. She understood everything, nodded, gestured, but not even a whisper escaped. The family grew worried. Doctors came, but found nothing wrong. Her throat was perfectly healthy. And yet, Peppa was changing. She grew quieter in every way, her footsteps, her movements, even her breathing. At night, it was as if she made no sound at all. George once said he woke up because he felt Peppa standing beside his bed, watching him. But when he opened his eyes, she was lying down, completely still and silent. On the third day, the whole house grew quiet. Too quiet. Even normal sounds, closing doors, clinking dishes, footsteps, seemed muffled. The radio wouldn't play. The TV had no sound, just a dull hum in the ears. Daddy Pig noticed that Peppa had started leaving notes to communicate. They were short. "I'm here. I'm not gone. Can you hear me?" But her eyes told a different story. They looked distant, like something inside her was fading. On the fifth day, she didn't get up. George woke to find her bed neatly made, her clothes folded on the chair. A single note rested on her pillow. "This is all that's left of my voice." Peppa was gone. No sound, no goodbye, no trace. The house fell into true silence. No laughter, no echoes. Even the wind outside seemed to stop. Sometimes George looks at her empty bed and whispers, "Peppa." And in the stillness, if you listen closely, you can almost hear,